My father was an extraordinary athlete, and I am quite certain that his firstborn son, namely me, did not come to earth with that particular set of gifts. I loved music and the arts, and I began to worry that I was a disappointment to my father because as he talked about his own childhood, it all centered around athletic events, and in his high school he was the star forward on the most important David and Goliath game that took place in the state of Utah. I didn't get to know my father too well in my early youth because he was starting a pharmacy and busy all the time. But when I was in high school, my father was invited to come to Chicago for a symposium to deal with drug abuse. And my mother was to attend with him, but for some reason at the last moment she couldn't go. So I went with him. I'd never spent that kind of time with my father. And on that 3.5-hour flight across the nation to Chicago, we talked about the possibilities of what we might do when we were there. And I asked him if we could go to see a play. Yes. A musical? Sure. A symphony concert? Okay. An opera? A what? That was his response. So he said, "You go buy the tickets," and he handed me his wallet. And greater love hath no man than to lay down his wallet to a teenager. When my dad came home from the first day of meetings, I had laid out on the bed in the hotel room all of these wonderful tickets. But the two most important seats were the premiere tickets to The Man of La Mancha, starring Jose Ferrer. He looked at them all and he said, "This is great. Now we might have a little problem on Thursday night." That was The Man of La Mancha. Because we're having dinner with Willard Simmons. When he said those two words, Willard Simmons, my heart just dropped. He was my dad's idol. He was to the pharmaceutical industry what Michael Jordan is to the basketball industry. But here he was not only going to meet him on Thursday, he was going to have dinner with him, and I was invited to come along. He could see that I was really concerned by that, because that was Man of La Mancha. That's the one I really wanted to see. He said, "Now don't worry, dinner's at 6. I see that this performance isn't till 8. 2 hours is plenty of time to eat." Now, where I grew up in River Heights, Utah, 2 minutes was plenty of time to eat. But when we got there, I realized this was not a meal. This was a pageant. It was really an experience. And by 7:30, nothing that resembled a main course had come our way. And at that point, I had to make a very serious decision, whether to tug on my dad's coat and say, "We really got to get going, Dad," or to remain silent and let him have his evening. And I thought, this evening's about him, and I'll just have to live with that. But at 20 minutes to 8, my father bolted to his feet and said, "Mr. Simmons, this has been one of the greatest evenings of my life, but I have a more important engagement with my son." I was stunned by that, because I could see this was very possibly the most important night of my dad's life, as far as his business was concerned. And we went out and came down from the top of the Prudential building and got into a cab. And I was glad it was dark, because there was saline solution leaking out of my eye sockets, and I didn't think that was okay for a dad to see a 17-year-old boy do that. We got to the theater just as the house lights were dimming. The curtain was about to raise. And at the end of Act 1, when Mr. Ferrer stood just a little right of center in a spotlight, we called them specials. He leaned on his crooked staff and he sang The Impossible Dream. And I was convinced that Mitch Lee and Joe Darian had written that for me, because I had been told all my life that my dream of spending a lifetime on the stage was impossible. But I knew that night that anything was possible because my dad believed in me. And he loved me not in spite of who I was and am, but because of who I was and am. And that has been with me all of my life. That is the greatest gift a parent can give a child.